Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast with me, Newcastle United editor Aaron Stokes. And unfortunately, we're bringing you this podcast today about Newcastle United failing to reach Europe next season. We thought that they'd done enough by finishing 7th in the Premier League, but unfortunately, Manchester United have gone and beaten Manchester City at Wembley against all odds, which means they will play in the Europa League. Chelsea will now play in the Europa Conference League, and that means there's no room for Newcastle United, unfortunately, to be playing European football next season. We're going to take you through exactly what it means. We're going to talk about what it means for the summer, keeping players, signing players. We're going to talk about what it means for the finances and FFP, and also what it means going into next season for Eddie Howe and his team. Ultimately, look, very disappointing. We were sat here this time last week. They'd just been riding high after a very good win at the end of the season against Brentford. We thought that that would be enough. 7th place was going to get them there. And we thought if anybody was going to win at Wembley, it would be Manchester City, the kings of winning trophies. Pep Guardiola, before Saturday's game, had won 6 out of 6 finals with Manchester City. But isn't it just typical Newcastle United that the one game that we needed them to win, they've unfortunately stumbled. That means Newcastle now just the second team in the last 10 years to finish 7th and not qualify for Europe. Most years that will get you there. And Newcastle fans had already started planning their trips to some very, very obscure regions that we're going to go through a little bit later in this episode. There could have been some fantastic away days for that die-hard support next season, but unfortunately it's not to be the case, and Newcastle will only really be fighting in 3 fronts next season. Look, I think we can't hide from the fact it means it's been a disappointing season for Newcastle on the whole. I think, given everything thrown at them, all the obstacles that they've had to overcome, if Newcastle had been able to qualify for Europe, I think you would have had to say the season has been a success. Certainly wasn't progress from last year, but I think a lot of fans would have taken that and said, look, we've made the Conference League. We've got a real good chance of going into that tournament as favourites next year. It's been a good season. And I think now you've got to look at it and reflect that actually, very disappointing Champions League exit in the group stage when you thought, they had to have at least qualified for Europa League by finishing 3rd in the group. Then they had that really disappointing exit in the Carabao Cup to Chelsea, where they looked home and hosed at Stamford Bridge. And then obviously they came up against Manchester City in the FA Cup, which was always going to be a tough ask for anybody. But I think they'll look back at the season and think it's a real opportunity missed. And they will obviously point to the fact that they've had injuries and a very, very hectic schedule, which has obviously made life hard. But it means Newcastle now no Europe next season. And next season would have been fantastic with Europa Conference League. I know some people will turn their nose up at it. I know some people will say that it'll be a distraction, and actually, finishing 7th and not getting Europe will actually be a bonus in the long run. But I'm sorry, I can't be subscribing to that opinion myself. I think, we've waited 20 years for European football to return to Tyneside. It's finally came back. I don't want to be giving it up after one season. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Newcastle would have had a real good go at that competition. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll bring it up on screen. If you're listening on your podcast provider, I will talk you through what you're missing on screen. Now, I've got here some of the teams that Newcastle United would have been playing next season. Now, this is just the projection. Obviously, there's some leagues that haven't finished or haven't, had their seasons come to an end, which means we don't know exactly who will be in this competition next season. But we've got a good idea of who Newcastle could have been up against, and just take a look at some of these teams that Newcastle could have had. As I say, these are projected pots, but at the top, Chelsea with a coefficient of 96, they are going to go into pot 1. They're going to be, probably the favourites to win that competition next year. Then in pot 1, you've also got the likes of France's Stade Rennais, Olympiacos, who are in the final later this week. You've got PAOK from Greece and Fiorentina from Italy. Now, looking on those, there's no superstar names. You're not going to get the likes of PSG, Dortmund and Milan as Newcastle had this season. But there's some very, very attractive ties in there. Now, if you drop down the pots, pot 2, for example, Real Betis of Spain, Freiburg from Germany, Dinamo Kiev and Sheriff Tiraspol, who have obviously played some games in the Champions League. Again, now that would have been the pot that Newcastle probably would have been in. their coefficient is very low. It's nothing like Chelsea, who, as you can see there, are on 96. So Newcastle probably would have been in pot 2 with a coefficient of around 28. That would have got them in above Dynamo Kiev, above Midtjylland from Denmark, and above Sheriff Tiraspol. Now, dropping down to pot 3, again, the ties just get easier and easier. You've got the likes of Genk from Belgium, Apoel Nicosia from Cyprus, CSK Sofia from Bulgaria, Besiktas from Turkey, Rijeka from Croatia, and Helsinki, the capital of Finland. Now, can you imagine some of the away days Newcastle United fans could have had in these tournaments? Imagine going to Genk on a Thursday night. Imagine a nice little early season trip to Cyprus when the weather's still nice and warm. The away days you would have got in Besiktas in Turkey, some fantastic venues. Yes, they wouldn't have been the San Siro. Yes, they wouldn't have been the Parc de France or Signal Iduna Park, but I tell you what, you would have got some fantastic trips. And as I say, I mean, pot 4, just moving down, you could have also had some nice little trips close to home. Shamrock Rovers in Ireland, looking like they're going to get a Europa Conference League spot. The New Saints from Wales. You've also got Victoria Guimarães from Portugal. You've got Hajduk Split from Croatia. Lugano from Switzerland. Dropping even further down, you've got the likes of Hearts, again, another close trip for Newcastle. You've got Brøndby from Denmark. You've got Brann from Norway. You've got Dynamo Batumi from Georgia, I believe. And then again, just dropping it in the 6th spot, you've got the likes of Dynamo Minsk, Viking Reykjavik, and Celje, who is actually the club of Rolando Arons in Slovenia. So that just gives you a flavour of who Newcastle United could have been facing in the Europa Conference League. Again, not too many world beaters in there, but as I've said, Newcastle would be very, very confident going into that tournament that they can actually go and win that. Obviously not to be the case now. And Chelsea, as I say, will go to that tournament. And yes, that some of them might be seeing it as a distraction, but you wouldn't be surprised if Chelsea go on and win that. Now, West Ham won the competition in 21-22, the second year that it was formed. Villa got very, very close this year. They got into the semi-finals. Now, what does that mean for them financially? Because we all know Newcastle United have made a lot of money from the Champions League. We know that any team in the Champions League, financially, it's an absolute game changer. Now, the Conference League isn't anything near that level. For example, West Ham won 22 million euros in prize money from winning the Conference League. Now, that's just under 20 million pounds. Now, to put that into perspective, Newcastle United made 17 million pounds roughly in prize money just from being in the group stage of the Champions League. Now, you compare West Ham winning the tournament, all the games they'll have had to play. Newcastle United only got 6 games in the Champions League, and they made just shy of what West Ham made. Now, that is not taking into account what they've made, commercially, what they've made from being on TV, the broadcast revenue that they've brought in. It's night and day. The finances in the Champions League are they're second to none, and Newcastle pocketed nearly 35 million pounds from 6 games in the Champions League, compared to 22 million euros of West Ham winning the full thing. Shows you how crucial it was. Now, a single win in the group stage of the Champions League is worth 2.4 million, which Newcastle would obviously have pocketed when they beat PSG. If you get a draw, it's worth £780,000, which Newcastle will obviously have got when they drew against AC Milan in the San Siro and against PSG in the Parc de France. Now, you've also got to factor in that there was 3 sold-out home games at St James's Park, and the fact that Newcastle United are on TV, across the globe. It's so lucrative being in this competition. It's why every club wants to be there. Aston Villa will be transformed from it this season with their own FFP. Worries Newcastle obviously dropping into the Conference League. It wouldn't have made that much of a difference to FFP. For example, being in the group stage of the Europa Conference League only really gets you about £2 million. Compare that to the Champions League, where even if you just got the group stage, you lost all 6 of your games, you'd probably pocket around £12 million in prize money, which just goes to show you, how different it is. The Conference League and the Europa League are vastly inferior to the Champions League in that respect. But obviously, it's not just about the finances, and it's not just about, the money that you bring in. It's also being seen on the global stage. It's also being able to attract fantastic players. And I think a lot of the worry now is, can Newcastle, one, attract these type of players if they're not in Europe, and two, can they keep hold of their best players? Now, we all know who I'm going to talk about in this part of the episode. It's Bruno Guimaraes and it's Alexander Isak, two players who, deserve to be in the Champions League. They don't deserve to be playing in the Europa League or the Conference League, never mind, not at all. And there'll obviously now be concerns that these two players have got teams interested in them and they can offer them Champions League football. Manchester City, for example, Bruno Guimaraes, they can offer them Champions League football, and they've got 4 league titles in the last 5 years to back up their credentials. Arsenal, who have been frequently linked with Alexander Isak, they're obviously pushed City close this year in the title race, and they've got Champions League football to fall back on. Now, you've got to hope that Bruno, who came out and signed for the club when they were in the relegation zone and was already back then talking about Champions League football, you've got to hope that the love that he's shown by Newcastle United is enough to keep him on Tyneside. Alexander Isak, again, I think it will take a lot more for clubs to get him away. He obviously doesn't have that £100 million release clause like Bruno does. And I also think it's going to cost you a lot more money to sign Alexander Isak than it would to sign Bruno Guimaraes, even if that release clause doesn't get triggered by the end of next month. You've got to hope that one season out of Europe isn't enough for them to want to jump ship. You've got to hope that they'll give it another go next year and say, look, if Newcastle don't qualify for Europe next year, we're probably going to have to go. But I don't think either of them are at the minute angling for a move away. But it's easier said than done, saying that you're going to stay at the club and publicly, looking like you want to remain at Newcastle United. But then if a club like Manchester City or PSG or Real Madrid or whoever comes in for you, it's easier said than done rejecting an offer like that when you know that you aren't going to be playing on the continent in the next season. In terms of attracting players, I think a really good example of this is just going back to what happened last summer. Newcastle United signed 4 players, spent north of 120 million on those 4 players. But ultimately, I don't think Europe played a big factor in 75% of that business. Sandro Tonali, ultimately, I don't think you're going to get a player of that quality for the money you spend if you haven't got Champions League football to fall back on. You've got to remember that this is a player at AC Milan who was a boyhood Milanista. He'd captained the club. It must have been an absolute dream for him to play at the San Siro every week, knowing that he was a AC Milan fan. Newcastle pulled off a major coup getting him in. I know obviously it hasn't worked out for well-documented reasons this season, but Champions League football was a big, selling point for Newcastle United, and it would have been again this summer had they, finished in the top 4 or the top 5. But then you look at the other 3 players they signed. Lewis Hall from Chelsea, who had finished 12th. He's also a Newcastle United fan, growing up. I don't think Champions League football would have been a big impact for him. It certainly wouldn't have helped, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Then you've got Harvey Barnes, who's relegated, and you've got Tino Livramento, who was relegated. So actually, I think, did Champions League football this year, was it the main reason they signed those players? I don't think so. You've got to look at some of the players that they've been linked with already this summer. They're really trying to get double deals over the lines for Tosin Adarabioyo and Lloyd Kelly, leaving Fulham and leaving Bournemouth. Is Champions League going to be the be-all and end-all? Potentially not. I think you've got to look at the likes of Manchester United, who are obviously very keen on Tosin. They've now obviously got Europa League football and a brand new project to sell to him. But Newcastle United will still be very confident of getting those two deals over the line, even though they're not going to be playing in Europe. Then it maybe becomes a little bit more tricky. Are you going to sign someone of Tonali's ilk? Are you going to sign someone of Bruno's quality if you haven't got Champions League? You've got to hope that behind the scenes they've still got enough in the tank to sell to these players and say, look, we're not in Europe this season, but trust me, we're going to be back there sooner than later, and we're going to want to be there every single season, and we want you here still coming in at a relatively low level before we're this big global powerhouse. We want you to get us there. Now, just going back to, the players that everybody doesn't want to talk about leaving, but just going back to Bruno, I think you've actually got, more concern with him leaving than Alexander Isak. And I think, weirdly enough, it's not Europe that's going to be the big thing. I think you've probably got his mate down the road, Lucas Paqueta, playing a big, big part in whether he stays or goes this summer, because Lucas Paqueta, who, is alleged to have breached betting rules, he's been charged by the FA, denies all these claims. But if the allegations ring true, he's looking at a very, very substantial ban. And it's very, very unlikely that he'll be playing for West Ham in the coming years. And it's very, very, very unlikely that Manchester City are going to go and spend 80 million on a player who they've really liked for the last couple of seasons. And I think that potentially turns the spotlight onto Bruno Guimaraes and them thinking, well, if we were going to pay 80 million for Lucas Paqueta, do we go out and trigger this £100 million release clause, or do we try and get him in June or July? So you have to hope that, you know, Bruno knows he's probably not going to get the type of adoration and the type of support that he gets here anywhere else. And you've got to hope that he's settled enough on Tyneside to stay put. Now, let's try and end on a positive. Let's try and end it about, you know, what Newcastle United can do next season. Now, yes, Europe would have been fantastic, and yes, it would have been a fantastic achievement to reach the Conference League this year. But I think you've got to remember what European football did to Newcastle this season. We know the amount of injuries that Eddie Howe suffered. We know, and I know that, you know, people say it's not an excuse, but we know that European football impacted that. We know that playing 3 games a week at times was too much for this squad to deal with, when a lot of them have never had to deal with that in their you know, previous clubs and in their career so far. We also probably had a medical team that weren't used to dealing with players that were playing 3 times in a week. So to try and spin it into a positive, Newcastle United next season could be a real force if they're back down to 1 game a week, 2 games a week at a push. Eddie Howe gets a lot more time with them on the training pitch. They're not travelling over to Europe to play a game on a Thursday night and then having to come back and play early on a Sunday away from home. Chelsea last season, as I've already mentioned, finished 12th in the Premier League, and you know, not having European football probably went a long way in you know, how we saw Mauricio Pochettino guide that team so far up the league, because they were really struggling earlier in the season and they finished with an absolute flourish. And you can imagine that's probably because they weren't so fatigued earlier in the season. That obviously wasn't enough for him to keep his job. Obviously, we look like Aaron Stokes, even though he won the FA Cup on Saturday and he's made it 2 trophies in 2 seasons. He probably won't be at Manchester United next season. Then you've got Brighton, obviously getting rid of Roberto De Zerbi. We don't know who's going to replace him at the Amex. There's a lot of things up in the air. Chelsea, Manchester United, Brighton, who are going to be in and around Newcastle this season. You know, a lot of uncertainty around them. Tottenham stuttered massively under Ange at the second half of the season. Aston Villa have now got Champions League football. Can their squad cope with that and cope with the demands and the jump that that's going to be? And then you've obviously got Arsenal, Liverpool and Manchester City. Liverpool bringing in a new manager as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the Premier League next season. Newcastle know that they're going to go there and potentially be playing every Saturday, every Sunday, potentially getting a lot more players back from injury. You're going to get Sandro Tonali back from a ban. You're going to hopefully strengthen with some really good recruits. And you're going to give the Premier League a right good go next season. Now, we've got to, anyhow, Newcastle anyhow, we've got to go for it next season. And I think not qualifying for Europe this season, yes, I'm trying to say it's a positive here and I'm trying to spin it in a good light. But I think it also puts pressure on Eddie Howe next season. I think if he starts the season slowly, you know, the ownership, the majority ownership over in Riyadh are going to be thinking, is it time to maybe pull the plug and go for somewhere else? You've got to think of the managers that could be available in the next couple of months. It looks like Carlo Ancelotti is going to be finished at Madrid next season. It looks like Pep could be standing down at Manchester City next season. Now, I'm not saying Newcastle United are going to go out and get these managers, but adding the fact that Thomas Tuchel could be available, Jurgen Klopp could be available, Xavi could be available, Jose Mourinho still available, Mauricio Pochettino potentially available. There's going to be a lot of managers with huge pedigree that Newcastle might be saying, you know what, we fancy a bit of them, and you know they've got really good track records on the European stage, in the Premier League and abroad. Let's try and get them in. So I do think it puts pressure on Eddie Howe, but look, I'm sat here, you know, fully supportive of Eddie Howe, and I think next season we'll probably see the old Newcastle where they're not fatigued. He's got a lot more time to work with them tactically on the training pitch. And I think Newcastle United have got to be positive next season that they're going to get back to where they belong, and they're going to hopefully push and knock on that door for the Champions League again. It does, as I say, mean that there's going to be no fantastic trips to Iceland or Romania or Moldova for the passionate supporters, but you know, let's be positive and try and hope that they can spin it into a good thing, keep the best players and also attract some good quality. Let us know in the comments if you're watching us on YouTube. Let us know on social media, if you listen to this on your podcast provider, what you think of Newcastle not making Europe. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Would the Conference League would have been too much of a distraction, or would it have been a positive for Newcastle to get some fantastic away trips under the belt? Let us know what you think. For me, I think I'm sitting on the fence as usual, and I think I'm saying yes, it would have been fantastic, but let's try and use it as a positive next season. Thanks very much for tuning in at this episode of the Everything's Black and White podcast. Myself and Andrew Musgrove will be back on Wednesday for a rearranged Monday show. We'll also have plenty of podcasts this week with the Mirror's Simon Bird and John Gibson doing his usual podcast as well with Andrew. Until then, thanks very much. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll speak to you very, very soon.